It was supposed to be an ordinary late summer day in St. Cloud, Minnesota. For 15-year-old Mary Reker and her 12-year-old sister Susanne, it was a chance to ride into town, buy a few things before school started, and enjoy the last of their freedom before fall routines set back in. But that afternoon, as the sisters walked along Northway Drive carrying new clothes and school supplies, someone noticed them. Someone who followed. By nightfall, the sisters had vanished. 2 weeks later, their bodies were discovered at the bottom of an abandoned quarry, and for nearly half a century, no one knew who put them there. This is the story of the Reker sisters, a mystery that haunted St. Cloud for 45 years before the truth finally emerged. St. Cloud in the 1970s was the picture of Midwestern normalcy. A college town of about 40,000 people just an hour northwest of Minneapolis. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, families left their front doors unlocked, and kids rode bikes across town without a second thought. Life moved at a steady, predictable rhythm. The Rekers family embodied that rhythm. Fred and Rita, devout Catholics, were raising 9 children under one roof, a bustling household where older children were expected to help with the younger ones, and everyone pitched in to make things run smoothly. Among them were Mary and Susanne, 2 of the middle daughters. Mary, 15, was thoughtful and responsible, the type of girl who did well in school and often helped her mom keep the house in order. She had a creative side too, and loved sewing. Her current project was a skirt she'd been carefully planning. Susanne, just 12, was softer spoken, still caught in that in-between stage of girlhood where she leaned on her older sister for guidance. The two were close, often seen together around town. On the morning of Saturday, September 28, 1974, Mary and Susanne asked their parents if they could walk into town. Their plan was simple: pick up some school supplies and maybe buy fabric for Mary's sewing project. Fred and Rita agreed, reminding them to be home in time for dinner. The girls dressed up for the crisp fall air. Mary slipped into her blue windbreaker, while Susanne chose a light jacket. Together, they set out on foot toward the Zare discount store, about 1.5 miles away from their home. It was a common enough errand, one they'd made before. That September afternoon had the kind of light that made everything look softer. Trees edged in gold, the sky washed clear. The Reker girls fit right into the scene. 2 sisters strolling side by side with paper bags crinkling at their sides. At Zare, they picked through notebooks and pencils, the kind of small errands every student needed before fall settled in. A cashier would later remember how polite they were, Mary doing most of the talking, while Susanne nodded along. At another stop, someone noticed them pause by a rack of fabric. Mary held it up against the light, tilting her head the way only someone serious about sewing would. That memory stuck, not because it was unusual, but because it was so ordinary. Witnesses along Northway Drive recalled the same thing. The girls looked happy, lost in conversation, smiling in that private way sisters do when they're talking about something no one else can hear. They blended so completely into the background of that Saturday, the college kids hurrying past, the families loading groceries, the traffic humming steady down the road. And yet, that ordinariness is what makes those last sightings ache. People remembered their jackets, the blue windbreaker, the lighter coat, and the way the shopping bags swung gently as they walked. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt off, and that's what made it so haunting. because those unremarkable details were the last traces anyone would ever see of Mary and Susanne alive. As the afternoon wore on, the Rakers' house carried on its usual rhythm. Younger kids played in the yard, Rita moved through the kitchen, and Fred busied himself with small chores. Mary and Susanne were expected back before supper. It wasn't even something anyone thought twice about. They were responsible girls, and their mile-and-a-half walk home was familiar, well-traveled. But as the sun dipped lower, Rita began glancing at the clock. 5 o'clock came and went. The girls still weren't home. She told herself they might have stopped to talk with friends, or maybe Mary had lost track of time at the fabric counter. By 6 o'clock, though, Rita was looking out the front window more often than she was cooking. When Fred called everyone to the dinner table, 2 chairs sat empty. The chatter of 7 other children filled the room, but the silence where Mary and Susanne should have been was deafening. Rita's fork sat untouched on her plate. After dinner, she picked up the phone and began calling neighbors, then friends from church. Each answer was the same. No one had seen them. By nightfall, unease turned to panic. Fred drove the familiar streets, hoping to spot the girls walking home in the dark. Rita stayed by the phone, waiting for it to ring with some simple explanation. At 9 p.m., Fred did what no parent ever wants to do. He called the St. Cloud police. When Fred's call came in, police logged the report, but treated it with little urgency. 2 young girls missing on a Saturday night didn't immediately raise alarms. Officers suggested the most common explanations. They had gone to a friend's house, maybe lost track of time, maybe even decided to stay overnight somewhere without asking permission. In the 1970s, that line of thinking wasn't unusual. Teens and preteens often vanished for a night and turned up by morning. To police, it looked like a runaway situation, not a crime, but Rita Reker refused to accept that. Her daughters weren't like that, she insisted. Mary had been excited about school, had even bought fabric for a sewing project she couldn't wait to start. Susanne was quiet, shy, not the kind of child who disappeared without a word, and both girls had promised to be home for dinner. They weren't wild, they weren't reckless, they were steady, reliable. Something was different here. Fred echoed her certainty. He'd driven every familiar route, scanned sidewalks, knocked on doors. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. The officers listened, but their posture didn't shift much that night. They told Fred and Rita to try to get some rest, that the girls might very well walk through the front door by morning. But sleep never really came to the Reker house that night. After the call to the police, Rita stayed near the phone, staring at it as if sheer willpower could make it ring. Every creak of the house made her heart jump. She replayed the afternoon in her mind on an endless loop. What time the girls left, what they wore, whether she'd missed some small clue when they walked out of the door. Fred tried to be the steady one. He paced. Then he drove the streets again in the dark, headlights sweeping across empty sidewalks and storefronts long since closed for the night. He circled past Northway Drive more than once, looking for any sign of movement. Each pass ended the same. Silence, emptiness, nothing. Inside the house, the other children picked up on the tension. Bedtimes came and went, but no one slept easily. Some of the younger ones whispered questions. Where are Mary and Susanne? Questions their parents couldn't answer. Rita tucked them in. but her voice trembled as she promised everything would be okay. By midnight, the truth hung heavy in the air. The girls hadn't simply lost track of time. They weren't at a friend's house, and no matter what the police suggested, Fred and Rita knew their daughters weren't coming home on their own. So they waited. The clock ticked into the small hours of Sunday morning, every minute stretching into an eternity. The house, usually full of laughter and noise, felt unbearable in its silence, and with every passing hour, the fear solidified into certainty. Something terrible had happened to Mary and Susanne. By sunrise on Sunday, September 29th, the Rekers' worst fears had not lifted. Mary and Susanne's beds were still empty, their school supplies still stacked neatly where they'd left them the day before. Rita hadn't slept at all. Fred, hollow-eyed, was already back out driving when the first light spilled across St. Cloud. This time, when the Rekers called police again, the tone was different. The girls hadn't turned up. No friends had seen them, and their absence now stretched into the second day. Officers began to take the case seriously. A missing persons investigation was opened. Word spread quickly through town. Neighbors knocked on the Rekers' door offering help. Friends from church came by with coffee, sandwiches, and questions. What were they wearing? Where did they say they were going? By mid-morning, volunteers fanned out along the routes the girls might have taken. Some drove slowly with windows open, calling their names. Others walked in small groups, scanning the ground for anything dropped or out of place. At the same time, police began retracing the sisters' last known movements. Officers visited the Zayre's store, then Woolworth's, speaking to clerks who confirmed seeing the girls. The timeline became clearer. Yes, they had been there. They had made their purchases. They had left carrying bags. But after that, the trail went cold. By afternoon, St. Cloud was buzzing with unease. In a town where children walked freely and families left doors unlocked, two sisters had vanished in broad daylight. And despite the growing search, no one could answer the question echoing through every home, every church pew, and every gathering place. Where were Mary and Susanne Reker? As Sunday bled into Monday, the search for Mary and Susanne intensified. Search dogs were brought to sniff along ditches and wooded patches, their handlers urging them forward as the animals tugged against their leashes. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields on the edge of town, pushing back tall grass with their boots, scanning for any sign of the missing girls. Helicopters circled overhead, their engines rumbling across St. Cloud, dipping low to scour the rivers, gravel pits, and farmland that framed the city. It was no longer just a family crisis. It was the town's. St. Cloud, with its reputation for safety and small-town trust, was suddenly unsettled. The Rekers church community organized prayer vigils, packing pews with neighbors clutching rosaries and whispering for a miracle. Flyers with sisters' school photos, two fresh-faced girls with brown hair and cautious smiles were tacked to telephone poles and taped to storefront windows. Still, there was nothing. Each fruitless day deepened the dread. A community that had once prided itself on safety now locked its doors at night. Parents tightened their grips on their children's hands. For Fred and Rita, the house grew unbearably still. Mary's half-finished sewing project sat untouched. Suzanne's favorite books waited by her bedside. The search was escalating, the community rallying. The morning of September 30th was gray and still, the kind of quiet that makes the sound carry farther than it should. It was one of those overgrown stretches near an abandoned quarry that the silence broke. A volunteer called out, and officers rushed to his side. There in the flattened grass lay Mary and Susanne. The scene was jarring in its clarity. Their jackets, Mary's blue windbreaker, Susanne's lighter coat. Police at the scene struggled to hold composure, the brutality standing in cruel contrast to the innocence of the sisters' belongings. At the Reker home, the knock at the door delivered the news Fred and Rita had already feared but couldn't bear to hear spoken out loud. Their daughters were gone. The shopping trip, the skirt Mary had dreamed of sewing, Suzanne's quiet companionship, all of it had been cut short in a single act of cruelty. The Rekers, surrounded by family and friends, were left with the unbearable truth. Their daughter's ordinary Saturday errand had ended in horror. St. Cloud wasn't just grieving, it was reeling. A town that had once embodied small-town safety now lived with a new, unwelcome truth. Evil had walked among them, and no one knew who it was. Detectives scoured the quarry for evidence. The ground around the girls told a story, though a frustratingly incomplete one. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints that led away, and no drag marks suggesting the bodies had been moved from another location. It looked as though Mary and Susanne had been killed where they were found. The brutality of the wounds weighed heavily on investigators. Multiple stab wounds to each girl and the slashing of their throats suggested rage. Personal, targeted violence. This wasn't opportunistic robbery. Their money and belongings were still there. It wasn't a sexual assault either. Nothing pointed that way. Whoever killed them had wanted to end them. That led detectives to their first theory. The killer wasn't a stranger passing through. He might have been someone from St. Cloud. Someone with a grudge. Someone who recognized them. That thought unsettled everyone. If it was true, then the murderer wasn't out there somewhere. He was here, living among them. The other theory was equally chilling. A drifter. St. Cloud sat on routes often used by hitchhikers, truckers, and transient workers. Someone could have passed through town, spotted the girls, and acted without warning. If that was the case, he could be long gone, and catching him might be impossible. Detectives pulled in everyone they could think of. Local men with criminal histories, drifters seen in town that weekend, even acquaintances of the Rekers. Each was questioned and each denied involvement. No evidence tied anyone to the murders. The lack of progress gnawed at the police and the public alike. The investigation had only begun, but it was tangled in dead ends. In the days after Mary and Susanne were found, detectives turned their focus to suspects. The violence was so frenzied, so personal, that the investigators believe it had to be someone close, someone who knew the girls, or at least recognized them. The first and most painful step was to look inward. Fred and Rita Reker were questioned at length, their timelines picked apart. Police searched for cracks, for inconsistencies, for any hint that the parents knew more than they claimed, but nothing surfaced. Neighbors had seen Fred searching the streets the night the girls went missing, and Rita had been home with the younger children. Their grief was raw and undeniable. Within days, investigators ruled the family out. Despite dozens of interviews and tips, a few names rose to the top of the suspect list. The first was a local man with a history of violence who had been seen in the area that weekend. He was known to carry knives, and his temper was no secret. Detectives questioned him heavily, convinced at first they'd found their man. But his alibi, confirmed by family, held up. Without physical evidence, they had nothing. Another early suspect was a drifter who had passed through St. Cloud right about the time the sisters vanished. He was picked up in a nearby county after bragging he knew details about the murders. For a moment, it looked like the break the police were desperate for, but under pressure, his story unraveled. Everything he knew had already been printed in the newspapers. Once the bluff was exposed, investigators had to let him go. Then there was a mysterious car. Multiple witnesses swore they saw a dark sedan. Some said green, others brown, moving slowly along Northway Drive the afternoon Mary and Susanne were walking home. It was reported again near the quarry where the bodies were found. Police pulled records, stopped cars that matched the description, even tracked down a few drivers. Each one denied involvement, and none could be tied to the murders. The car slipped into legend, a ghost vehicle that haunted the investigation for years. In the end, none of it stuck, and that was the most terrifying part. Their top suspects either cleared themselves or were cleared by circumstance, leaving St. Cloud staring into the void. By winter, the case files grew thick with reports but thin on answers. Detectives revisited the quarry, sifted through the evidence again, and pored over witness statements, but the picture never sharpened. The physical evidence was meager. No murder weapon, no fingerprints, no forensic trail that pointed to a killer. In 1974, DNA testing was decades away. What they had was circumstantial at best, and that wasn't enough to charge anyone. Eventually, the case went cold. It sat in the St. Cloud police files, passed from one detective to another over the years, each hoping for a break that never came. The murders of Mary and Susanne Reker became a ghost story in central Minnesota, whispered about in classrooms, remembered in news clippings on anniversaries, and never truly forgotten by the people who lived through it. By the 1990s, the murders of Mary and Susanne Reker had faded from the headlines, but not from memory. Other cases had taken center stage, most notably the abduction of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling in 1989, just 30 miles from St. Cloud. That case drew national attention, changing the way the country viewed child safety and leading to new laws on sex offender registries. But detectives never let it go. In a police storage room sat boxes marked with the sisters' names, Mary and Susanne, their blood-stained clothing, bags of school supplies, knives are covered near the scene, stacks of brittle witness statements. Each file told the same story, over and over, but without an ending. Every few years, a new investigator would open up the case again, leafing through the reports, yellowed with age, walking the quarry site that had long since grown over with weeds. The evidence was always the same, but the hope was that technology, something beyond the reach of 1970s forensics, might finally reveal what human memory and witness accounts could not. The breakthrough came not in the frantic days of the 1970s, but decades later, thanks to something investigators back then could never have imagined. As forensic science advanced, investigators submitted the samples for testing. What returned was the kind of lead they had waited nearly half a century for, a DNA profile strong enough to identify a suspect. The name was Jerome Henry Tiffy Edwards. He wasn't a stranger to violence. Edwards had a history of knife assaults and explosive outbursts. He'd lived in St. Cloud in 1974, drifting from place to place, and had left town not long after Mary and Susanne were killed. For decades, he slipped beneath the radar, moving on, starting over, leaving his past behind. By the time investigators had his name, Edwards was already dead. He had died in 2015, never facing a jury, never answering for what he had done, but science spoke where he could not. When police compared the DNA from Suzanne's clothing to samples from Edward's family, the results were undeniable. It was him. The drifter who had haunted the edges of the investigation in rumor and theory was now confirmed as the killer. After 45 years, the mystery that had gripped St. Cloud finally had an answer. Justice had come too late for the courtroom, too late for Fred and Rita to see their daughter's killer held accountable. But the truth at last had been unearthed from the silence. Mary and Suzanne's story was no longer an unsolved case file. It was a wound with a name. The murders of Mary and Susanne Reker never got the same national attention as Jacob Wetterling, but for central Minnesota, they were just as defining. And when the case was solved 45 years later, it stood as proof of what families often cling to, that even in the coldest cases, answers can eventually surface.